Perfect. So as Eric said, I'm Allison Kanoti. I'm the Director of Forest Health and Monitoring with the Maine Forest Service. And among the responsibilities in my job is working to respond to some of the invasive insects and diseases that are coming into our state and moving through our state. And so tonight I'm going to give kind of an overview of emerald ash borer, as well as a look at the history here in the state, some of what the state response is, as well as some of what you can do with the knowledge that emerald ash borer is here. There we go. I don't know if I can move that lobby thing from my screen or not, but we'll ignore that. So the emerald ash borer is an invasive insect. It's native to Asia. And like a lot of contemporary invaders, it probably arrived in North America on solid wood packing material, which is things like crates and pallets and dunnage, things that help move goods between countries and also within the country. Soon after one of its contemporary invaders, the Asian longhorn beetle, arrived in the US, new rules for solid wood packing material went into effect. And that has reduced the number of introductions into through international trade. But we do still hear about insects and diseases that get through those phytosanitary requirements. Once it arrived here in North America, it spread further on things like nursery stock, so rooted trees, but also firewood and other solid wood material. And an early study in Michigan, where it was first detected, tracking the early spread of emerald ash borer, linked more than 75% of the new infestations to movement of infested firewood. And so this is the insect that really brought the focus on firewood as one of the important vectors of invasive forest pests. So the emerald ash borer is a metallic wood boring beetle. It's in the family Buprestidae. They're also known as flat-headed borers. And they're called metallic because they have this bright metallic sheen. The adults are small. So one of the things to think about is they fit pretty comfortably on a penny. So they're about a ½ inch long. They're about the same size and shape as a black oil sunflower seed. So if you have that in your mind as to the scale reference, then that's helpful. A lot of times we'll flash up these big images of the insects, and it can be hard for folks to get that perspective of what they really look like when you're looking at them like in your hand. So they are small, metallic, tapered towards the end. They're built for flying. We do have a look-alike that is very long-legged and really built for running, and that's one of the tiger beetles, the six-spotted tiger beetle. The larvae are found underneath the bark of the tree. They're creamy white and flat with bell-shaped segments, and I believe I have some images of those further on in the presentation. The adults, when they come out of the tree, they create a D-shaped exit hole. So that's because of the shape of the insect's body. It's kind of flat on the top and rounded underneath. So it creates that capital D-shaped exit hole. The adults will be emerging probably within the next month. They emerge about the same time as another invasive organism, the black locust tree, is flowering. So when the black locust flowers are out and so fragrant and abundant, you can expect the emerald ash borer adults to also start their flight season as well. They'll be out through the growing season until the hard frost. So the eggs are laid on the outside of the bark of the tree, and the larvae, when they hatch, they bore underneath the bark, and they create a real characteristic S-shaped gallery. And we'll look at some of those a little bit later. The hosts of emerald ash borer, or the food for emerald ash borer here in Maine, are primarily ash trees. So those are trees in the genus Fraxinus. They are one of the few trees that can be sort of more easily recognized because of their branching patterns. So like maples ash trees have opposite branching patterns where the buds come out opposite each other on a branch. And so if you look closely at the pattern of their branches up in the canopy, you can see that each side shoot has a twin. Of course, there's some aborted buds sometimes, but in general, you can see that pattern of the opposite branching. They have what's known as compound leaves, so many leaflets on a single leaf stem. And those are shown in the images. Sorry, the images here. You can see that we have 3 species in Maine. We have white, it's probably the most abundant in the natural forests, green and brown ash. And then their bark pattern, again, it's generally has this diamond shape. It can be very furrowed, especially in the green ash, and kind of flaky in the brown ash. If you're not familiar with it, the guide, The Forest Trees of Maine, provides a really nice comparison of the 3 species, as well as a pretty easy key as far as how to tell them apart. You can tell them apart a little bit as well by some of the habitats that they're in. And it sounds like Tony will be providing kind of an overview on that in his talk, so I really won't get into it in too much depth. The seeds of ash trees are these oar-shaped or paddle-shaped seeds, and you'll see them, you know, sort of underneath the seed-bearing trees. They are similar to the maple seeds in that they're built for flight. You know, they can be picked up and carried pretty far on the wind with those paddles, and also in some of the areas where they're growing in wetter sites, be carried on the water as well. We do have another host here in Maine that's planted as an ornamental, and that's the white fringe tree. I know I'm sitting in Augusta tonight, and I know that not a 5-minute drive from where I'm sitting, there's a real beautiful white fringe tree. They're gorgeous when they flower. They have fragrant flowers. They're kind of related or in the same group as lilacs. They don't look like much after they flower, just a nice green shrub. But it was found in 2014, it was discovered that emerald ash borer can reproduce in this as well as our native ash trees. This is a shrub that's native to other parts of the US, but is not native to Maine. And it is, as I mentioned, it is used in ornamental plantings. And looking at other, you know, members of the ash family, ash is in the family Oleaceae. And so that's the olive family. And so we do know that ashes can be attacked by emerald ash borer, that fringe tree, and that's the one in blue, can be attacked by emerald ash borer. And also, and I just underlined it here, that olive can also be attacked by emerald ash borer, that we're not going to be growing those in Maine anytime soon. So far, not known to be hosts for emerald ash borer, but also in the same group are the Forsythia and oh, help me out here. This is privet, I think, and then lilac. So these are used ornamentally, but they are not at this stage known to be a host. Things that are not host to emerald ash borer, but are sometimes mistaken for hosts of emerald ash borer are our mountain ash species. So these are known for their bright red berries. They have bark with pretty distinct lenticels, these often horizontal little patches on the bark that are important for gas exchange, and often used as an ornamental tree. They have these bright red or orangish berries. They're both native mountain ash species as well as horticultural varieties of mountain ash. These are closely related to the apples, roses, and cherries, so they're a fruit tree, just like those other species. And they are not host to emerald ash borer. They are often favorite of a woodpecker called the yellow-bellied sapsucker, favorite trees for them to create wells on. And so sometimes folks will mistake the damage by that yellow-bellied sapsucker for emerald ash borer damage, because the sap wells are kind of D-shaped as well. So that's a little bit about the host. So how much does that impact us here in Maine? Well, when I tell you that ash is only about 2% of the forest, you might think, you know, kind of what's the big deal? Well, even though it's only 2% of the forest, there are almost 500,000 ash trees in Maine that are over an inch in diameter. And in some places, they're a very large component of the forest. So sometimes they're really concentrated in forest stands. So that's in our natural settings. We have those 3 species that make up about 2% of the forest in Maine. But if we think about it from our urban and our community and our landscape perspective, that also adds to the importance of this insect in Maine. And that's because ash was widely planted because of its tolerance for some of those stressful conditions, such as urban and community environments. So sometimes it can make up a pretty large proportion of the trees in those settings. When Dutch elm disease came through and wiped out many of the elms, a lot of the times what was used to replace those elms were ash trees. A good example of that, if folks are familiar with the mall at the University of Maine, it has these beautiful rows of green ash trees that were planted when the elms started to fall apart there. An example I heard just this week is that the city of Bangor, about 20% of their trees are ash that are the responsibility of that community. So it can be a pretty extensively planted tree in, intentionally in those real community settings, and also what I think of as a lot of times less thoughtful plantings where you have developments going in and that sort of knee-jerk, okay, we're just going to plant this whole parking lot with ash trees. We've probably all been in dozens of parking lots and dozens of developments where ash trees were the tree of choice. Looking a little bit at the history of emerald ash borer and the detections, it was first found in it's first recognized in 2002 in the Detroit, Michigan area. So that's this area of Michigan here. And also on the other side of the border, emerald ash borer doesn't actually stop in Canada. I just didn't have a great graphic. It was found at the same time on the other side of the border in Canada as well. And so that was in 2002 when it was actually identified. The decline had already started in those forests around Detroit. And the beetle probably arrived there in the mid to late 90s. So it had been there for quite some time before it was detected or identified as the problem causing the ash decline in that area. And it has spread both sort of in a logical, what we would think is a logical manner, out from that central infestation point, and also had a lot of hops and skips. And an example of those hops and skips is soon after the detection in Detroit, there were introductions on nursery stock in Maryland, and those were never able to be eradicated. Another good example is in Maine, when we had emerald ash borer first detected in our state, it was found not only in southern Maine, where it kind of made sense since it had been in New Hampshire for quite a number of years at that point, but also in northern Maine, adjacent to an infestation that had been detected in Edmundston, New Brunswick. So that was a disjunct population. It was probably moved with either live plants or roundwood material. And again, firewood is often the vector of emerald ash borer. I will mention, since I haven't yet, is that there is no species that is uniformly tolerant against attack from emerald ash borer. We used to think that it was a death sentence for any tree that was impacted by this insect. I'll say, as a rule, forest health professionals tend to be fairly pessimistic. And a lot of times when something first arrives, it just seems like it's going to wipe out an entire species. We have seen that there is some tolerance to attack, although no outright resistance has been identified at this stage, but there seems to be tolerance to attack by a small, and I say very small, proportion of the ash trees that are native here in North America. Looking at what emerald ash borer detections looked like in Maine, I mentioned that it was found at the same time in southern Maine and far northern Maine. That is the red on that map there. So up here you can see Edmundston, New Brunswick, and far northern Maine. And then here in the border area of York County, we had our first detections in the same year in 2018. And by 2019, we had a detection in Cumberland that was on a trap in one of the city parks, and then in Portland. And then in 2021, Oxford County, 2022, Androscoggin and Kennebec, 2023, Penobscot, 2024, Sagadahoc, and then just this year, we've also already had detections in Hancock and Waldo counties. So it is marching at a rapid pace, sort of erratically across the state and through the area where ash are really important in the state. So I'd say you could argue they're important everywhere, but we do have real concentrations of ash in this belt that runs from southern Maine up through southern Aroostook County, where the ash trees are really more concentrated in our natural settings. I will also mention that to date, we have no detections at all in Franklin, Knox, Lincoln, Piscataquis, Somerset, or Washington County. That doesn't mean that they're not out there. One of the things that I'll touch on a little bit later is that emerald ash borer can be very hard to detect. I did want to point out, hopefully by demonstration, if I can get my tool to go away here. I did want to point out that, well, maybe I'm not going to be successful, that we do have a dashboard for emerald ash borer now. If you scan the QR code that's at the bottom of that map, it will take you to our website, www.maine.gov/EAB. And if you're going on a mobile device, the first thing you'll see is a link to open up the dashboard in full screen. If you're on a regular computer screen, then you will see basically the same image as I have presented here, which has the infested towns known to date. And this is not quite live, but it's once we have it confirmed, the town is lit up. And then also the regulated area. So there is an area, one of the things that the state has as a response is quarantine on movement of ash material and hardwood firewood. And so that regulated area is by design actually larger than the detected area because of some of the administrative issues surrounding quarantines. So you can see we have a regulated area both in the south and also in the north. You may also notice that the infestation is progressing at a more rapid pace in the south than in the north. And that is probably related not only to the size of the population in the north, which is relatively small, but also to the climate conditions up there, which until the populations get really dense, seems to keep emerald ash borer on a 2-year life cycle. Sorry. So why is emerald ash borer a problem? So there's a number of reasons that emerald ash borer is a problem. One of the primary ones is probably pretty obvious, even with the 2% of the forest, it still has significant ecological impacts. One to hydrology, so both green ash and brown ash are associated with wetter conditions. And so when you have a lot of tree mortality in places with those moisture conditions, then you can have changes in the hydrology of the system, more water available in the system, and which can lead to things like flooding problems. And then another one I wanted to highlight was biodiversity. So as an agency, I'd say we have a lot of pictures of pest organisms, and I can very easily find these 4 here in our archives that are specialists on ash trees, and it's just a small sample of the number of things that are specialists on ash trees. And so when a resource like ash is greatly reduced in an ecosystem, then the organisms that depend upon them are also greatly reduced in that ecosystem. So Up on the upper left, you have one of my favorite groups of insects, and that's a sawfly. So this is a black-headed ash sawfly, which, as you can imagine, entomologists are very creative in their naming conventions. It has a black head, it feeds on ash trees, and it's a sawfly. This middle one here is really pretty cool. It's a spider mite that is on ash, and very, very rarely its populations explode, and you get this ghostly scene where you've got all this webbing being created by this mite species. This sort of S-shaped scripting in the outside bark of an ash sapling. So this tree is probably about the same diameter as my thumb, but it has visible the galleries of a cambium mining fly that relies on ash for its life cycle. And this big chunky thing is one of our sphinx moths. It's a great ash sphinx. It feeds primarily on ash trees. So that's just a small sampling of the biodiversity that can be impacted when ash trees are reduced in the environment. Also really key here with ash is cultural impacts, and you'll be hearing from APCA and you'll be hearing from Teresa more from a more informed perspective than my own on the cultural impacts on our Wabanaki nations with the threats to ash trees. But just suffice to say as an introduction that it has profound cultural impacts on Wabanaki societies. And I'm going to touch in some depth on infrastructure impacts. I already talked about the urban canopies and how much ash is part of our urban tree canopies, but I'm also going to touch a little bit more on tree failures and and why that's something that we all need to be cognizant of. When we think about traditional forestry impacts, some of the industries affected with ash decline are furniture making and flooring. It's one of the industries that ash is used for. Tool making. There's a tool, if you're not familiar with it, called the peavey that was actually invented in Maine to be used in the logging industry. It basically is a simple tool that allows for leverage on heavy logs. It was invented in Maine. The family that invented it still has the company that makes peaveys, and they still are 100% reliant on ash for those peaveys. So that's an example of tool making impacts that we would see here in Maine. Sporting equipment, I don't know if you know, but many of the baseball bats have been ash in the past. There's some shifting to other species. And then I'll leave as an industry as well the Native American basket making. It's both an industry and an art. So why is emerald ash borer a problem? Part 2, and I already alluded to this a little bit. Early detection is difficult. The adult beetle is very small. By the time you're seeing the adult beetles, the populations are already pretty high, because for the most part, those adults are hanging out in areas where there's foliage. They're attracted to the foliage after they exit the tree. And so they're not where humans are spending a lot of time for the most part. The signs are hard to see. Now, the picture I have there is probably not a great illustration of that. The signs are readily visible here. You can see the S-shaped galleries. You can even see the D-shaped exit holes from emerald ash borer, but they can be hidden and they can be very hard to see. So trees can look perfectly healthy, but be riddled with the galleries of emerald ash borer, especially in winter when they don't have leaves. And then another thing is that the symptoms are confusing. There are a number of other conditions that can cause decline in ash trees, which is what we usually see first when we're recognizing emerald ash borer damage. So there's things like a phytoplasma that causes ash yellows. There are environmental conditions as well that can cause ash canopy decline. And then I've probably hammered on this enough, but emerald ash borer spreads really easily in firewood. The camper there, I took that picture on I-95 south of Newport. They got off in Newport, and the firewood in the picture is actually the firewood that's shown in that camper carrier. came from Ohio. Guy knew all about emerald ash borer, knew that firewood was restricted, and felt like it was important to bring it in order to make sure that he had good firewood for his fire. So I did promise that we'd get a better look at the larvae, and here it is. This is actually one of the life stages that you're most likely to see, because you can peel back the bark and find them in trees that you suspect might be infested by emerald ash borer. They are going to be underneath the bark of ash trees. We often use draw shaves in order to pull back the bark when we think we have an infested tree. The larvae are kind of flattened, sort of grub-like. A lot of people say they look a little bit like tapeworms. They're cream colored, and they have bell-shaped segments. And so what I mean by that is that these segments here are shaped like a bell. So you can sort of picture this segment as a bell and this segment as a bell. You can see that again up here in this larva. Now, when they get to be mature larvae, they do get kind of chunky. And so that's what this one is. This is also an emerald ash borer larva. And you can kind of see those bell-shaped segments here still, but it is much more chunky than you might think when I say flattened larva. And that's because it's getting ready to pupate. Another good characteristic, and if you're taking a picture of emerald ash borer or what you think is emerald ash borer to submit, another good characteristic for emerald ash borer are these two spines at the back end of the larvae. Those can help to diagnose it as potentially emerald ash borer or definitely not emerald ash borer if those spines are absent. So what might lead us to scrape the bark from the tree would be blonding. So there are other insects that woodpeckers will go after underneath the bark of ash trees. There's something called the eastern ash bark beetle that you can get a tree that looks very much like this tree here, where all of the bark has been removed or most of the bark has been removed due to the activity of woodpeckers. And that tree could just as easily be attacked by our native eastern ash bark beetle as emerald ash borer. So you really need to get a closer look at what is happening underneath the bark. And you can see here that the bark has been scraped away and it's revealed those S-shaped galleries on this tree here. And you can see as well that we get woodpeckers successfully getting in and getting the larvae from the ash trees. So one of the things I was asked to talk about was a little bit about the state response to emerald ash borer. And we do have still to this day a monitoring program for emerald ash borer. It's funded in part by USDA funds through what's called the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, Plant Protection and Quarantine Program. Through them, we get purple traps and lures, and we get some funding in order to have the manpower to hang those trap trees. In 2012, before emerald ash borer was found in the state, we had close to 1,000 traps in the state, all the way through 2015. After 2018, I think that's actually incorrect. I think it was around 2019, we went down to about 200 traps in the state, and that's what we have on an annual basis as far as our purple trap program, looking for spread of the insect through the state. The way these work is that they're a color that's purportedly attractive to emerald ash borer, as well as they have a scented lure that is also attractive to emerald ash borer. And the trap itself is like a giant, messy flypaper sticky trap. It's not pliable like flypaper. It's corrugated plastic, but the way it works is entrapping those insects on the trap. We also have a program where we use girdled trap trees. Again, we're using these now for the most part trying to track the spread of this pest. Often we're using them to target areas where we might want to release biological control organisms in order to help manage the pest. And it is something that a landowner or a town manager can also implement on their own. Usually sometime in the latter half of May, the first half of June, the Trees are girdled, which means the bark is removed from part of the trunk all the way around the tree so that the flow of water and nutrients is disrupted, and the tree slowly dies over the summer. Sick ash trees are more attractive. They smell better to emerald ash borer beetles than healthy ash trees. And so they are more attractive than the ash in the surrounding areas, and you're basically using that tree as a trap. Then the following fall, the trees are felled and the bark is stripped to look for evidence of attack from emerald ash borer. So we found this to be a really sensitive tool and also flexible in its deployment. You can also use a native wasp to look for emerald ash borer. So this ground-dwelling wasp, it's also often found in places like baseball fields and other compacted sandy areas like cemeteries. We've seen them in patios. We've seen them in old sand pits as well, especially where folks have been running their four-wheelers around them. It's a ground-dwelling wasp that lives in colonies, but it's not a social wasp, so it's not like a yellow jacket. It's not going to attack you if you go out into its colony. It hunts buprested beetles, so those metallic wood-boring beetles, and it can find emerald ash borer if it is in the area. So you can monitor its prey in order to detect emerald ash borer. It's flying in the same time period as emerald ash borer, although it starts a little bit later. We usually see it flying from July to August. And so this is a tool that can be used by folks who have colonies near where they're interested in monitoring. And probably the most important tool, especially now, is a sensitized public, especially where we have this reduced trapping program where we're only looking at 200 sites, about 200 sites and about 50 trap trees in a given year. So a good example of this was the detection in North Andover, Mass. It's been quite a while now, but there was a person who was having their lunch at this restaurant and looking out across the road. They thought they saw blonding. They reported it, and it was confirmed as emerald ash borer. So that's just an example of how we rely on the public in order to help detect emerald ash borer and really any forest health threat. So I mentioned that we use the girdled trap trees sometimes to try to target our biological control for emerald ash borer. So biological control uses organisms that are natural enemies of a pest to try to bring it into balance in a system. And in the case of this biological control, we're trying to bring this invasive pest into balance in the new system. The search for natural enemies happens in the place where the insect is native. The candidate organisms then go through very rigorous screening to make sure that there are not identifiable non-target impacts. So making sure, for instance, that they don't feed on any buprested, that they specialize in emerald ash borer in the case of this one. And I'll mention that exploration, that testing, all of that is done by cooperators in both the federal and academic research realm. And then we have a partnership with the federal government that allows us to receive these organisms. We don't pay for them, but we receive them and release them at places across the state that we've identified as suitable for their establishment. So in the case of emerald ash borer, we have 3 different organisms that are being released. They're parasitoids and they're wasps. And you can see them pictured at the bottom of this slide. So all the way over on the left, we have Oobius, which is this little tiny wasp. I thought I had an inset picture of it. I guess I don't, or it's maybe it's animated and it'll come up later. But that's this little tiny wasp. It lays its eggs in the eggs of emerald ash borer and then parasitizes it within that egg. We have Tetrasticus planopenisi, which attacks larvae, and it has a short ovipositor. You can't really see it very well, but it isn't very long, and so it can't go into thick bark. But it can be very effective in thin barked sections of the tree and also in smaller diameter trees. And then we have Spathius gallinae, which has a longer ovipositor and can also be successful in ash trees with thicker bark. And we've released these in nearly every county where emerald ash borer has been detected to date, but not quite. So we don't have a site in Saginaw County yet. We don't have a site in Waldo County yet because we have not yet identified a forest area that is suitable. And we do not have yet a site in Hancock County where we have releases. Oh, see, I told you I had an inset. There it is. So biological control organisms are not something that's available to the individual in the case of trying to manage emerald ash borer. We know that they have some success in the aftermath forests as far as allowing trees to reach reproductive age where they're bearing seeds and can then help to produce the ash forests or the ash trees of the future. So when you're thinking about, those future forests, if you're going to have some of the mature trees around, sometimes you may have to use insecticides to keep those trees around. And so I'm going to start by talking about when to treat trees in sort of your landscape, so the trees around your house or in your public spaces. And so one of the first things to ask is whether the tree threatens the safety of the public or your safety or a structure, or if you want to keep that tree alive for other reasons. It's important in the landscape, for instance. And then going down that flow chart, you get to, so if you say yes, is the tree in good health? Is it in a good place? So for instance, does it impinge on utility lines or not? And then is it a good size? If the answer to that is yes, then you would plan pesticide treatment if you want to keep it alive, or removal if you don't want to keep it alive. And then as far as the no side, you would plan removal if it's not in good health, good place, and good size. And I'll talk a little bit more about when you are planning pesticide treatment and when you are thinking about applying that pesticide treatment. If the tree does not threaten structure or safety, you can actually just leave it to fall apart, and it will get brittle and it will get dangerous. But if it doesn't have a target, then that may be okay. So on the next slide, well, no, I moved it, I guess. So one of the important things with responding to emerald ash borer is to have a plan. And so this is targeted to a town, but even in your own dooryard, if you have an area that has a lot of ash trees, you want to have a plan. And if you're not going to keep them alive, then you may want to think about removing them sooner rather than later. So the things that apply to a town can also apply to you. As far as inventorying your ash, know what you have, in your yard, around your parking areas, those sorts of things. Prioritize treatments and removal, monitor their conditions, and set aside funds for pesticide treatments, tree removals, and tree plantings are some of the things that you can do. And there's all sorts of guides out there available to help guide decision making. And the reason that it needs to be having a plan, having a guide, is that you can then help to improve outcomes when emerald ash borer does impact your ash. Because it's not a matter of if it's going to impact your ash, it's going to be a matter of when it's going to impact your ash. And so as citizens in our towns, we are looking at, really a cascade of ash mortality potentially coming our way, impacting town budgets, impacting utilities, and those sorts of things. And so if you're not part of your town management, starting to advocate for that within your town is something that you can do. So things like tree inventories can be important because you can't manage if you don't know what you have. And so tree inventories help with prioritization, and they also help with estimating costs. And so even if it's just a tree or 2 trees or 3 trees in your yard, having that idea of what the costs are can be important. And then just helping to engage the public, raising awareness about the problem, and developing and implementing a plan can be important. And there are lots of opportunities to learn from and with others. So Maine is in the good position of having emerald ash borer detected more than 15 years after it was first identified in North America. And so our partners to the west, as well as to the north in Canada, have been sort of the guinea pigs as this insect has moved through our forests of the continent. And so they have made mistakes, they have tried things out and failed, they've tried things out and succeeded, and we can learn from those things. And so I've put a few examples of the things that folks have put into place here in Maine here, as well as some information from other states. And I would say we are very lucky to be at the tail end of the eastward spread of this insect. And I know it feels like I'm sort of beating a dead horse, but I do want to just really emphasize that there are risks to doing nothing. Again, whether it's your own yard or whether it's a tree on the road that you drive every day, or if it's trees in your city. And that's uncontrolled costs, canopy loss, and probably the most important in those developed settings is unpredictable failures. And so you don't have to look far before you can start to see some stories about really significant impacts of ash stem failures as far as causing damage to property, causing loss of life, and those sorts of things. So one of the things that we have learned from those who have experienced emerald ash borer before us is that the trees very quickly lose their structural integrity after a really dense emerald ash borer infestation. Stem failures, people talk about them happening on a blue sky day with, no noticeable wind. So basically, the structural value of the wood is about akin to styrofoam. And I'd say the arborists are aware of this. Places like Asplund, they won't climb to remove ash trees April to October because they don't know what condition they're in. Similar for Davy and some of those other large arborist companies. And this is an example from last year of, excuse me, a newspaper article from Western Mass where emerald ash borer has moved through. And the quotes pulled from the article are, the homeowner or the business owner is glad no one was in the parking lot when the tree came down. It was the 3rd time in the last 12 years that an ash has fallen on that particular building. There was no wind. It's hard to tell when an ash tree is dead because the bark looks good. And in the end, when it came down, even though he thought it looked healthy, he could put a screwdriver through it. So really bringing home that those trees become structurally compromised. So when to remove trees, if you know you're not going to treat them, think about a plan to remove them because they become more expensive and more complicated to remove once emerald ash borer moves into an area. As far as insecticides, excuse me, we don't generally recommend using insecticides until emerald ash borer has been found within 5 to 10 miles of the trees of interest. We do recommend that you keep an eye on your trees and you monitor their condition. Trees can be treated and successfully kept alive even after emerald ash borer has attacked them. But once their crown condition really starts to decline, you can't bring them back. The most reliable product for treatment of ash trees is emamectin benzoate. It is available to commercially licensed pesticide applicators, and it is a trunk injected product that requires specialized equipment. We strongly recommend working with a licensed professional applicator if you're considering treating ash trees. I wanted to talk a little bit about another project that we're working on with emerald ash borer response, and that is using tree injections to keep productive seed producing ash in the forest, to keep some of that mature component of ash trees in the forest. This is based on lessons from things like chestnut blight and emerald or Dutch elm disease, where we have a bottleneck of the genetics of those species due to the mass die-off of those trees in our natural landscapes, and also reactive harvests of those trees. So the key challenge that's identified, and this comes from my coworker Gabe LeMay, who's running this project. The key challenge is how to protect ash populations when resources to apply treatment are limited. We've been using these injectable systemic insecticides. We can't do it across a landscape or even a forest stand. So we're focusing on pockets on specific sites to preserve the ability of those pockets of ash trees to produce seeds. And that just gives sort of the overarching goal of the project is to protect exemplary, unique, or otherwise important areas of ash forest to serve as reservoirs of ash genetic diversity and management models. And this is the same type of system that would be used in a urban or landscape tree. It's using trunk injections, which are brought systemically through the tree and kill the larvae within the tree, and also have impacts on the adults feeding on the foliage of the tree. They are, we are using this Arborjet method and using the active ingredient emamectin benzoate. The treatments should hold up for about 3 years. That's what past research has shown. And so we intend to get back to these sites every 3 years as long as the funding holds up for it. These are applied after leaf out in the spring. That's the ideal time to do it. Later in the summer, you get less movement of the product. And then importantly, it's unlikely to harm predators of emerald ash borer, like the parasitoids and the woodpeckers. It will harm other insects feeding on those trees, though, because they are a broad spectrum insecticide. So far, these have been implemented at 3 sites in Maine, and across 12 trees at each of those sites. The trees are tagged and will be tracked throughout the life of the program. We are continuing to try to identify sites throughout the range of ash trees, and they'd be treated after emerald ash borer has been detected in an area. So that's just kind of a broad overview of emerald ash borer, as well as some of the programs that we have to respond to it in Maine. I just want to emphasize again that some of the things that the individual citizen can do is to use local or heat-treated firewood. This is important not only for emerald ash borer, but also for a number of other invasive forest pests and diseases. We move insects and diseases when we move firewood long distances. As far as local is concerned, we generally consider that about 10 miles or less. Keep an eye on your trees and your forests. Check for signs of pests and diseases and report signs of them if you do find them. From the sort of broader forest health perspective, other things that you can do is to use native and locally grown planting material. Be really careful in moving soil and compost and other landscape material, because you can move pests with that as well. Not emerald ash borer, but things like winter moth and jumping worms. use those pollinator-friendly practices and an integrated approach to pest management to support beneficial insects. So not only things like the parasitoids that we're releasing for emerald ash borer, but other natural enemies of things that we consider pests. And I do want to also put a plug in for our newsletters, which we call the conditions reports. You can find them on our website at maine.gov/forest health. Our first one of the season will come out sometime next week, we hope. And then it will have information about emerald ash borer as well as other forest pests of concern, and it will help you spread the word and not the pests. And this is my final slide. It has resource information, example of our conditions reports, and QR codes which you can scan to get to these different resources. So on the left is the website for emerald ash borer. In the middle is the landing page for forest health within the Maine Forest Service. And on the right is the QR code to get to our landing page for the conditions reports. So I think I may have used more time than anticipated, but happy to take some questions that we have time for, and happy to stick around if folks have time.
Thanks so much, Allison.
Yeah.
We'll let other questions roll in. Not seeing too many. I did notice. Sorry, Ella. Ella asked about halfway through the program, how many years do we think the Belfast infestation